Good evening. Welcome to the Baltimore Museum of Industry's program, Reconstructing the Story of the Key Bridge. My name is Deborah Carden, and I'm the BMI's Director of Development. It is a pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to introduce our presenter, Mike Keithy. Mike is a member of the development and membership team at the museum and used to work in our education department. I'm sure many of you remember him as the moderator of the popular Baltimore Narrative series featuring Jack Burkert. Tonight's presentation is intended to provide a deep dive into the history of the Francis Scott Key Bridge from its inception up until about 1980, and it draws on materials from the BMI's archives, contemporary reporting, and other local sources. Tonight's program will last about an hour. We have set aside time at the end for questions and answers. You've probably noticed that your microphones and cameras are disabled for the webinar, so please use the chat and the Q&A function on Zoom to drop in your questions. You can do them at any time, and our staff will be monitoring them so we can circle back at the end of the program. And just one thing before we begin, I really want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. We have been overwhelmed by the enthusiastic response that we've received, not just for tonight's program, but also for the BMI's efforts to preserve the history of the Key Bridge and the Port of Baltimore. And a very special thank you to everyone who has made a donation in support of this initiative. Your generosity helps the BMI create programs like this and also makes it possible for the BMI to collect, preserve, and document this important history. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks everyone for joining us. As Deborah said, my name is Mike Keithy, and I'm currently part of the development team at the museum, used to be part of the education offices. And tonight's program is going to be primarily focused on the history of the Key Bridge. This is part of a much larger initiative that the Baltimore Museum of Industry started last spring, shortly after the Key Bridge came down, and will probably be ongoing for the next, certainly through the end of this calendar year and probably into 2026 as well. Part of a much larger initiative to collect and preserve stories about the Key Bridge. We had a fantastic program really focused on honoring the individuals most directly impacted by the collapse of the Key Bridge last spring. We hosted that program live at the museum in December. And this is meant to kind of satisfy the members of our audience that we know really like to have that history itch scratched. And wanted to have a little bit more of a general background on what led up to the collapse of the kind of whole history of the bridge prior to its collapse. This will run roughly up to about 1980. This is not primarily going to be like a debrief on the collapse of the bridge or the events from last spring. There are certainly going to be some references, which will be unavoidable, even some comparisons. To earlier events, but this will not primarily be focused on the collapse of the bridge. I will end tonight's program with a little bit of information about what Baltimoreans can expect over the next few months and years as the Key Bridge is rebuilt, but more on that later. In the meantime, jumping right into the presentation, tonight's presentation is, to a large extent, about the construction of the Key Bridge and the people who built it. And one way of answering the question of who built the Key Bridge is by looking at one of those good old government agencies that can be a three-letter acronym, the Maryland State Roads Commission, or SRC. The State Roads Commission officially goes back all the way to 1908, and for most of the 20th century was the organization in charge of building the state's major highways. In particular, they had an incredible amount of activity right after World War II. Between about 1948 and 1965, they constructed about over 3,000 miles of Maryland's highways and over 500 bridges. As we go through this story, it might not be too obvious. They're not gonna, I might not mention the name too often, but as the Key Bridge is being built, uh, the state of Maryland creates the Maryland Transportation Authority in 1972, and the State Roads Commission and its responsibilities are kind of added to that organization. So in the course of the story that we're telling tonight, the State Roads Commission will actually officially cease to exist. That brings us, that period of activity that I mentioned after World War II brings us up to about 1960. The During that large period of activity after World War II, the State Roads Commission widened a ton of existing roads, built new paths all over the state. And the major challenges facing them going into the 1960s were not laying down new roadways, but expanding access and alleviating traffic along the most congested roadways in Maryland. This is a map of the area around Baltimore. Really, we're looking at the map in what the city looked like in 1960. But I wanted to jump ahead a little bit. This map actually comes from 1970, and what's helpful about it is if you look closely, the solid red, yellow, and green lines show the the major trafficways in and around Baltimore City. The green in particular circle running around the city is the Baltimore Beltway. And um, the reason why I wanted to show this map from jumping ahead a little bit to 1970 is because it shows some of the anticipated projects for the State Roads Commission. The dotted lines are roads that have not been built yet. And these are the major construction projects that they're looking at in the late 60s and early 70s. In particular, while most of the beltway that we know today has been built, it only runs from about White Marsh around to Ritchie Highway in Anne Arundel County. So the southeast section of the beltway has not been completed yet. In terms of major crossings through Baltimore City, we do have um, we do have one major access, aside from driving through the city itself. In order to cross the harbor, uh, commuters and drivers in as early as the 1950s could take um, the Baltimore Harbor Tunnel, which is now part of Interstate 895. As I mentioned, the Harbor Tunnel. By the 1960s, the Harbor Tunnel had been open for a few years, opening in 1958. But even when that project was first planned, it was always meant to be a temporary measure in terms of not being the only access point through the harbor. So even when the planning for that work was being done going back to the early 1950s, it was known that Baltimore was going to need multiple access points through or over the harbor. This graph, taken from the Baltimore Evening Sun, shows the increase in traffic for the Harbor Tunnel between 1958 and 1966, with the amount of cars traveling through each year about doubling. Um, so really showing the need for an extra access point and setting the stage for the next major construction project. So we have the Harbor Tunnel opened in 1958, and the next access point is going to be, in its initial planning, what is referred to as the outer crossing of the Baltimore Harbor. It's part of a larger project to complete the Baltimore Beltway to finish that southeastern section in that dotted green line. Um, and you might notice what I've labeled here, the outer crossing tunnel. This is the structure that we're here to talk about tonight, what will eventually go on to become the Francis Scott Key Memorial Bridge, although it won't get that name until much later in its planning and construction. And of course, what's labeled here on the map is not a bridge, but as it is initially planned, a tunnel. There are uh, a few considerations as you're planning major construction projects, particularly in this era. When the harbor tunnel, that first crossing, was first proposed, the engineering company that suggested it to the state of Maryland laid out the reasons why a harbor crossing would be a good idea and said it was about a toss-up as to whether the state should build a bridge or a tunnel. In general, the advantages for a bridge is that it's cheaper to build, cheaper to maintain over time. Because it's cheaper, it's easier to build a wider bridge, having multiple lanes of traffic going each way. And if the bridge proves to be inadequate further down the line, it's much easier to expand. A tunnel has none of those points in its favor, but it does have one major consideration, and that is it was particularly at the time, it was thought that tunnels would provide better access for ships. There would be more clearance for ships passing above a tunnel than potentially underneath a bridge. Baltimore is fundamentally a port city, so even though it looks like this is a long list of positives for a bridge, the Maryland State Roads Commission ends up going along with the plan to build a tunnel. There is another dynamic to this as well, and this gets a little bit into the political history of the bridge. Not only was there a debate between a bridge and a tunnel, this is a conflict between Maryland's executive and legislative branches of government. The governor at the time was Spiro Agnew, governor of Maryland for just a short period in the late 1960s. And the Speaker of the House in the Maryland State Legislature was Marvin Mandel. Spiro Agnew, governor, and the State Roads Commission working on within his administration favored a bridge, whereas Speaker of the House Marvin Mandel and the Democrats in the state legislature favored a tunnel. So over years of debating back and forth the advantages and disadvantages, Governor Agnew's camp advocating strongly for a bridge, Governor Mandel won the battle in moving forward with a tunnel, largely because simply a matter of procedure, it was up to the legislature of Maryland to write the bill that would allow them to fund the project. And over again, despite the governor's objections, Speaker Mandel would only put forward a bill proposing a tunnel specifically. The Eventually, in 1968, the State Roads Commission backs down. Essentially, they're tired of having this debate. They just want to move forward with one construction project or another, and so they concede, and the governor allows the project to move forward as the Outer Crossing Tunnel. There is another element to this as well, which later the Baltimore Sun would report was widely acknowledged at the time, although it didn't show up as much in the press. And that brings us to one of the construction companies that we'll be talking about this evening. What ended up being the primary contractor on the Outer Crossing project, the J.E. Griner Company. The Griner Company was founded in Baltimore, in Maryland. It got its start in 1908 by a former B&O Railroad bridge engineer. He Mr. Griner had started out as I mentioned, working for the B&O Railroad, and he was primarily a bridge designer, working his way up through the company, and eventually breaking out into start his own independent company. Over the next few decades, his company would contribute to the harbor tunnel that I mentioned earlier, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, the Hanover Street Bridge in Baltimore City, which is located just around the corner from in South Baltimore, just around the corner from where we're located here at the Museum of Industry, and many other projects. By the 1960s, the J.E. Griner Company was the the company, the engineering contractor in Maryland, with the most experience and the most resources for a wide variety of projects, particularly for bridges. That meant that they were very well connected. And the thinking at the time was that Governor Agnew had very close connections and was very good friends with some of the executives at the Griner Company. And if his proposal went through to build a bridge, they would get the lion's share of contracts. And there were supposedly, Speaker of the House Marvin Mandel opposed a bridge because he didn't want those contracts being worked out through under the table deals and a disproportionate amount of the funding going to Governor Agnew's friends at the Griner Company. Giving some credence maybe to those accusations at the time, the director of the State Roads Commission, who was appointed by Governor Agnew, and the one leading the State Road Commission's objections to building a tunnel, advocating for a bridge instead, was a man named Jerome B. Wolfe. And as it just so happens, Jerome Wolfe had a fairly short stint in in government affairs, serving for the director of the SRC for only a few years, and then going to work as an executive in the J.E. Griner Company. So he was one of the executives at the company who was overseeing the project of building this outer harbor crossing. But getting back to the kind of the debate between Agnew and Mandel, things move very quickly for Governor Agnew, even despite only being governor of Maryland for a few short years. He attends the Republican National Convention and is selected as the vice president candidate on the ticket with Richard Nixon. What we have here is a poster from the Nixon campaign archived with the Library of Congress requesting volunteers. And of course, as it would turn out, Nixon is elected president in 1968, and Agnew ends up following him to Washington. This leaves the government of Maryland in the position of having to choose a governor. And the procedure was not a general election to fill the vacancy, but for the legislature to appoint the next governor. And they choose Speaker of the House Marvin Mandel to step up as governor of Maryland. So not only did Mandel win the battle of tunnel versus bridge when he was Speaker of the Maryland legislature, but now he gets to be the governor who oversees the construction of the project. I should mention that Mandel went on to win to win election, I believe, twice. So it's not like he was entirely removed, or to win re-election as governor of Maryland. So it's not like he was entirely removed from the democratic process. So this brings us back to our map from the late 60s, the map of Baltimore. And this is how we get, in addition to the harbor tunnel, the construction of the outer crossing tunnel as our second thoroughfare through Baltimore City. Now, so far, that political history has only touched on the state of Maryland. And it's a logical question to ask, well, what did the city think of all of this? There are, as you see on the map here, a fair number of dotted lines crisscrossing their way through the city. During this period, the city was facing its own major construction projects. And their main input in this debate about a bridge between a tunnel was advocating for the state to not prioritize the outer crossing, but to prioritize an inner crossing closer to the center of the city within the confines of Baltimore City itself that would better alleviate traffic passing through the downtown. That project would eventually become the completion of Interstate 95 and with the Fort McHenry Tunnel. But at the time, that crossing was planned as a bridge. So we have, again, a flip-flop. What would go on to become the Key Bridge was originally planned as a tunnel, and what would go on to become the Fort McHenry Tunnel was originally planned as a bridge. So this brings us up to 1970. The State Roads Commission was all set to move forward with in 1968, the first contracts were awarded. The Griner company that I mentioned got a small contract for the outer harbor crossing, mostly doing in environmental surveys and mapping in the pre-construction phase. And larger portions of the contract were given to other companies because it was a tunnel and not their forte of a bridge. And the funding for the outer harbor crossing was arranged through the sale of $220 million in state bonds. So they sold the bonds to investors, large banks and individuals, or large investment firms, a range of institutions and individuals, with the idea that they would be paid back, paid in interest, and fully paid off in time. And the funding from those $220 million in sales was going to fund not just the outer harbor crossing, this tunnel that we've been talking about, but also an expansion of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. The estimate when all this was worked out in 1968 was that the outer harbor crossing would cost $32.5 million. And for the first 2 years, the focus was on that expansion of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. By 1970, when work begins in earnest for planning the details of this tunnel through underneath Baltimore's harbor, they have to redo the assessments of the costs, and they find that it's gone up from 32 and a half to about $50 million. So there's now back to the question of, should this project be a tunnel and not a bridge? Because again, you might remember that one of the advantages of a bridge was the lower cost. The only advantage that a tunnel had going for it was, in theory, better access for ships, although folks were certainly aware that the size of ships were growing rapidly in this era. This is a small excerpt from a Baltimore Sun article from 1971 commenting on it and recognizing that as ships are growing larger, that advantage that tunnels had is actually being reduced. That there are as many accidents with ships running aground on tunnels as there are with ships either striking or not being able to pass under bridges. So that one advantage has been lost. And in light of the growing cost concerns, the Governor Mandel, the one who won that battle of bridge versus tunnel, now has to go back to the State Roads Commission and say, this isn't going to work, come up with a different plan. And the only solution that they're able to come up with is switching from the tunnel to a bridge. So despite winning the battle when he was head of the Maryland State Legislature, in the long run, Mandel loses the war, and he simply can't fight against the simple fact of inflation and economics, and the project is switched to a bridge. As I mentioned, throughout this time period, the major focus within Baltimore City itself for the mayor and the city council is not what the state is working out with this outer crossing, but coming up with their own plan for the inner crossing. They run into their own issues, not so much about funding, but with incredible outpouring of community concern about what a bridge right next to Fort McHenry will do to ruin the view of the fort, a major landmark, a historic landmark in South Baltimore. This is, of course, a modern photo of the National Park Service, or from the National Park Service, a photo of Fort McHenry. You can imagine what ended up happening was the harbor tunnel, or sorry, the Fort McHenry tunnel being built. So it is not in this shot, passing underneath the water, just a short distance from the fort. But you can imagine in an alternate history, if that bridge project would have gone forward, the fort would have been in the shadow of the bridge. And I have to imagine in that alternate history that drivers going over that Fort McHenry Bridge might be a little bit nervous every time they do those cannon demonstrations. But as fate would have it, that project switches from a bridge to a tunnel. And so we finally have the landscape that Baltimoreans know today of a bridge over the outer harbor and two tunnels closer in to the downtown area. Um, but there's still some concern from the city about prioritizing and where resources should be spent. So as the state is figuring out their new plan for this bridge and trying to switch things around, the mayor writes or the mayor delivers a letter to the State Roads Commission advocating that they focus their resources on the inner crossing. This is an article from the Baltimore Sun written on June 18th, 1971. Now, if all of this back and forth about harbors and tunnels and inner and outer crossings is getting a bit confusing, don't worry. You're in good company with the writing staff of the Baltimore Sun in 1971, because in this article about the mayor's letter to the State Roads Commission, they completely mix up the two projects. They talk about the inner harbor crossing as if it's already been funded by the state, which it hasn't. That's only true of the outer harbor crossing. And they talk about they mix up the switch, which was planned as a tunnel and which is going to be a bridge, and just have the details all turned around. That was particularly perplexing for the officials at the State Roads Commission because they're in the middle of a major campaign. Everyone's pretty much agreed that the outer harbor crossing has to be a bridge. They can't fund a tunnel anymore. But uh, it takes more than just the wishes of all the administrators involved to change course of a major project. And one of the hurdles is that they actually need to go out and get consent from at least two-thirds of the people who purchased those $220 million worth of state bonds. So there is a whole story that could be a whole presentation in itself of this massive campaign where the individuals in charge of managing those state bonds have to go out knocking on doors and calling people and trying to track down who these bondholders are, who were largely anonymous. They were not recorded when those bonds were sold. There's actually, in order to redeem the interest for those bonds, they were given a booklet of coupons, essentially little tickets that they were supposed to tear out and bring to particular banks in order to receive their interest payments. Right as this was happening in 1971, the first interest payments were coming up, and so the State Roads Commission had to reach out to the banks and say, "Hey, everybody that brings those coupons in, try to get their information. Hold on to that for us." So over the course of about 6 weeks, a month and a half, they're doing all this work to try to contact the bondholders. Ultimately, they are successful. They do manage to get the consent of two-thirds of the bondholders, and the project can move forward. But in the midst of this, the Baltimore Sun is writing this article, completely mixing up the details of the two projects. Here's a Sun article from the next day, June 19th, 1971, where they talk about this campaign to get the consent of the bondholders. And it quotes the director of the State Roads Commission, who says, "We're quite concerned about the impact that this confusion may have on our bondholders. These are two completely separate projects." So you can imagine the frustration that they're having with the Baltimore Sun as they're trying to contact folks and they're saying, "Well, wait, I thought I saw in the sun, it was a tunnel and not a bridge." Now, if you're following the story so far and you're looking at the headline on the screen, you might notice a problem still. In their article on their second day of reporting on this issue, in their article where they're publishing this kind of soft correction, acknowledging yesterday's mistakes, they are still mixing up the projects and talking about the outer harbor crossing as if it is going to be a tunnel when it's in fact going to be a bridge. And so the next day, the third day of reporting on this subject, on June 20th, the Baltimore Sun has to publish a formal correction stating clearly that these are two different projects and that the outer harbor crossing planned as a tunnel is now going to be a bridge. I have to laugh a little bit at the Confusion in the Sun offices at the time, but obviously their reporting has proven to be a great resource on in researching these topics. So I do have to express my appreciation for them in recording all of these events. So with the bond issue resolved, there is one other major concern, which is the state had going back to 1968, this between 1968 and 1970, the state had gone through all of the proper clearances, gotten approval for it to build this tunnel underneath Baltimore's harbor. The initial permitting was approved by the Army Corps of Engineers. They were the ones who had jurisdiction over tunnels in those days. Uh, but in the switch for a bridge, well, that's the Coast Guard's authority. So they had to redo a lot of the assessments. And between 1970 and 1972, when they essentially made the decision to switch the bridge, they had to redo a lot of the planning work. And the deadline for getting the Coast Guard to issue a permit approving this project was October 11th, and the Coast Guard didn't sign the permit until October 10th. So they were coming down to the wire uh, in getting the necessary, or I'm sorry, I have the wrong months there, as it says on the screen here. The final deadline was June 11th, and they did not get the final approval from the Coast Guard until June 10th. So coming down to the wire and getting the approval. But that is the final hurdle. The major contracts have been awarded. They figured out they got the consent of the bondholders, and they got the consent of the Coast Guard. And finally, in 1972, construction begins. Now, if you were really following along with the presentation, you might remember a slide from a couple minutes ago in which I said that the project was these details were being worked out initially in the late 60s. The bill approving funding for this was in 1968. Construction was supposed to be between 68 and 72, and the bridge and the project was supposed to be done in 1972. So they're now finally just getting started when the original estimates had them finishing. Over the next few slides, I'll mention some of the companies who worked on some of the many companies who worked on different aspects of the bridge. And throughout, I'll be using some photos that were generously shared by the Maryland Transportation Authority, particularly the folks at Key Bridge Rebuild, who are overseeing the reconstruction of the bridge, who I'll be speaking a little bit more about at the end of tonight's presentation. But going through some of the companies, acknowledging the major work that they did over the course of years, we're back once again to the Griner Corporation, that powerhouse of Maryland engineering projects throughout the 20th century. They had originally been given only a small share of the contract of the funding money in order to do some of the initial planning for the outer harbor crossing. Their main project during this era was supposed to be the expanding the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, which, as I mentioned, was tied in with this same project. But with the switch to a bridge, the contracts are reconfigured and they do end up getting a much larger share. They end up being the prime engineering consultant. So they are the main ones designing the bridge and overseeing the construction. The Another major contractor working on the approach spans and some of the main span itself is a company out of New York called, at the time, Singstad, Cahart, November, and Herca. This is another kind of powerhouse of 20th century engineering. While the Griner Company was the authority on building bridges in Maryland and around the United States, Singstad and the component companies were the main authority on building tunnels. And with the original project, Singstad, Cahart, November, and Herca were given the lion's share of the funding in order to be the ones doing the main planning and building of the tunnel. With the switch to a bridge, they do stay on and are still one of the major contractors, but a lot of their work is split with another company, a much smaller and much newer Maryland company by the name of Zolman Associates Inc. Um, Zolman Associates had only just gotten started a few years earlier. They stepped onto the scene in a big way, particularly during the years that Marvin Mandel was governor of Maryland, which is when they started receiving engineering contracts from the state. And between 1968 and 1972, their billing from Maryland state contracts, the amount of money they were getting from the state, rose astronomically from 320,000 to $1.4 million over the course of just 4 years. Another company that was primarily contracted to work on the approaches to the bridge and build the toll plaza was Green Associates Inc. And there were a number of smaller contractors working on various aspects of the project. Um, when we initially planned out what tonight's presentation would be, I knew that it would be far too large of a project to go into depth on all these different aspects. There could be an entire hour-long presentation just on these companies, the work that they did over a number of years on not just the outer harbor crossing, but a range of other projects at the same time. This map here jumps ahead a little bit in time. It shows the access points that the Key Bridge will have as it's nearing completion, but it shows kind of the larger scope of the project because not only were they building the bridge itself, but wrapped up in this project was extending the Baltimore Beltway and having to build miles of highway leading up to it. And a number of companies worked on the whole range of that work. Balfe Company and Savin Brothers pouring concrete for the substructure, Whaling City Dredge and Dock Corp doing similar work. Des Moines Steel produced the majority of the steel for the bridge. And a number of companies were working specifically on related projects around it, like Atlas Machine and Ironworks building the Curtis Creek Bridge, allowing traffic to approach the Key Bridge, and Dewey Jordan Inc. Doing some of the highway work leading in from Anne Arundel County as well. The ultimate design for the bridge was for it to be what's called a continuous truss bridge. You can sort of see it's not a great angle from this picture, apologies there, but the main supports for the bridge are a series of horizontal beams, essentially making triangle shapes, running continuously along the main span of the bridge, which was over 1,000 feet long. Um, the there are advantages and disadvantages to multiple different bridge designs. For a continuous truss bridge, can be more cost efficient to build. It also requires a little bit more precise engineering because each one of the connection points between those horizontal beams needs to be able to carry the weight for its portion of the structure and convey that weight to the main supports. A engineer for the Griner company was interviewed as the Key Bridge project was wrapping up, and they commented that um, the company did consider a the company did consider another bridge design and ended up going with the continuous um, truss specifically um, specifically for cost concerns. Their main consideration, they thought about building a suspension bridge, which, if you can picture the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, is perhaps the most famous suspension bridge. But they said specifically that attaching these suspension cables would have borne a considerable cost, and the continuous truss approach and it won out for funding considerations. Zooming in a little bit on the same picture, there were considerations made for if the bridge were to be damaged, particularly if a ship going off course in the harbor channel were to veer off course and approach the bridge itself and its support structures. The two main protections that were put in place, you can see this round structure in the water itself. That's a continuous column that goes all the way down to the floor of the harbor. It's filled in with concrete. And what you can sort of see, just the little curved shapes on the outside, are kind of rubber bumpers. These structures are referred to as dolphins, and four of them were placed around the Key Bridge, two on either side of the two main supports for the bridge. Last spring, when the Key Bridge came down, there was a considerable amount of reporting trying to, folks trying to weigh in on what could have prevented this. And a lot of the talk was about why the Key Bridge did not have additional dolphins in comparing it to other bridge that had more extensive protections. There is another protection in place as well, or was, which is what you see here, this rectangular frame around the bottom of the two central support structures. Only one of them appears in this picture. This is a rectangular frame, about 100 feet wide in its on the longest side, made out of concrete, wood, and steel, and it is meant to serve as a barrier. The idea being that if a ship did manage to collide with the structure, that the fender may be damaged, but the bridge itself would survive and continue standing. Uh, the looking ahead at some of the major events in the history of the construction of the Key Bridge, there is a tragedy um, uh, in 1973 during its construction. In Hawkins Point, as the construction is going on, a large pile of steel cables falls over in particularly high winds. The winds kick up unexpectedly. The pile of cables fall over. A number of folks are injured, but one individual in particular is killed. Uh, his name was David Hilling, and there were certainly a number of injuries in the years that the bridge was being constructed. But as far as I'm aware, that was the only fatality in the project's history. More bad press for the bridge before it's even been finished. And jumping a little bit back to our political history, I'm going to try to move through this very quickly. This may be a story a little bit familiar to some of the folks in the audience if you're familiar with your 1970s US politics, and particularly if you lived through that era. On August 5th, 1973, the Baltimore Sun writes an article kind of harkening back to the earlier thoughts about who is going to get these construction contracts and whether or not those assignments would be above board. In this article, they lay out accusations not only against former Governor Agnew, now Vice President of the United States, but also implying that current Governor Mandel, in the switch to a bridge, did some inappropriate assignment of contracts as well, particularly to the enrichment of one of the companies I mentioned earlier, Zolman Associates. The next day, Vice President Spiro Agnew, goes on a national press conference and announces that he is under investigation. There is a probe going back to even before he was governor, when he was the chief executive for Baltimore County. This probe coming out of the federal attorney of Maryland's office is looking into like years and years of contract assignments and whether or not they were done appropriately. In these days, there was no requirement that major construction projects went through a competitive bidding process, and it was not unusual for the administration in charge of the project to assign the contract to whoever they wished. In theory, that was put in place to make sure that the project went to the most experienced engineers, even if they weren't going to come in at the lowest bid, and to uh, reduce the chances or reduce the situation where a number of companies spend an exorbitant amount of time and energy bidding on contracts for then only one of them to get the assignment. Because of course, at some point, someone is going to have to pay for all of that work. So if a company bids on 10 projects and only gets one of them, well, they're going to have to somehow wrap the costs of those 10 bids into that one project that they actually got. So there were explanations in the press from engineering companies as to why there were advantages of doing things this way. I do want to move a little bit quickly through this, but did want to acknowledge that it was a Republican prosecutor appointed by the Nixon administration who had family ties to Republican senators who was in charge of this investigation. He'd made a name for himself in the years prior to this, investigating the Maryland state government and Baltimore City Police. This was an era, particularly when Agnew announced that he was under investigation. The Watergate news about the Watergate scandal had been building. It wasn't, it hadn't reached its climax, but it was certainly common knowledge, and it was an era of increased scrutiny in government affairs. On October 11th, 1973, just to wrap up this story, Vice President Agnew ends up resigning. He pleads no contest to a part of the charges against him. He does not address the accusations about all of this about engineering firms essentially bribing him for contracts. But part of the accusations are tax evasion as well. And you might be able to get away with bribes, but the IRS is certainly going to get its share. So he pleads no contest on the tax evasion in particular, gets a $10,000 fine, and resigns as vice president. Skipping ahead a little bit to 1977, I don't want to be accused of any one-sidedness here. I want to acknowledge that Governor Mandel was prosecuted as well for the accusations against him. He ended up serving the last 15 months of his governorship in a federal prison, and an acting governor served in his stead for Maryland. He was years later exonerated on appeal, so the official record is that Mandel was exonerated for these accusations, but he was at the time found guilty. The charges against Agnew did include the assignment of contracts for the project that would eventually become the Key Bridge. The accusations against Mandel were focused on contracts around horse racing, horse race tracks. But getting back on course for our story, there is a positive outcome for this. As I mentioned, an era of increased scrutiny for government affairs. And in 1974, there is a law requiring competitive bidding on major projects over $25,000. There is a joke written in the Baltimore Sun that with this increased scrutiny, the state will have to, this is written in kind of looking at the year ahead, and says that the state will have to lay off all of the contractors working on the Outer Harbor crossing. That isn't entirely true. All the companies that were working on the crossing do continue on, but there is a kind of restructuring of some of these companies in order to distance themselves for the individuals who were accused of improper kind of collusion with the Maryland state government. And so some of the companies I mentioned earlier, Green Associates Inc. becomes Century Engineering Inc., and Zolman Associates becomes Baltimore Transportation. Or I'm sorry, yes, Baltimore Transportation Associates. But moving ahead in our story, with all this increased scrutiny around how the contracts were assigned, there's also scrutiny about why it's moving so slowly, how expensive it is. There are a lot of investigations in the years that the bridge is being built, making sure that the contractors are not wasting the state's money. The costs for the bridge do rise and rise, going, as this article says, $33 million over what was originally planned. Uh, but in hindsight, it does seem like the contractors were doing their diligence and not overcharging the state. The reason why those costs were so high was because of all that confusion around bridge and tunnel and the extra 2 years it took to replan the whole project. Uh, because the project started years later than it was supposed to, good old inflation caught up, and that's why it ended up costing so much more. In the course of these events, as the bridge is nearing its completion, there is finally a name decided. Instead of calling it the Outer Harbor Crossing, as the project was known for almost a decade in its planning, it becomes named the Francis Scott Key Memorial Bridge, the name that we all know today. Uh, a large part of that work is attributed to one individual, a man named Ben Womer, who petitioned the state government over the significant amount of time. He was a strong advocate for recognizing the War of 1812 and Baltimore's role in it, Fort McHenry, and specifically Francis Scott Key, the author of the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. And so he is part of this community effort to decide the name for the bridge, which the state of Maryland approves. And afterwards, he moves on to another major project, which is to get a buoy. He really wants a buoy in the harbor as close as possible to the spot that Francis Scott Key was standing when he wrote or when he watched the Battle of Fort McHenry and was inspired later to write the Star Spangled Banner. Construction continues on. There are delays, as I mentioned. This project that was meant to be finished in 1972, they start building it in 72 and say it'll only take 2 or 3 years to build, but work goes on. It stretches out through 1975, 1976. Uh, in in late 1976, things are really coming down to the wire. It is almost finished, and the last step, in theory, is to pour 1,000 feet of concrete, completing the roadway for the bridge. The contractors in charge of this say that all they need is 5 or 6 or 5 or 6 days of good weather. As long as the cold weather can hold off, they can get this concrete poured, and then the bridge can open in December of 1976. As it turns out, they do get that good weather, but it is still not enough. There is one last project facing them, which is to some of the guardrails along the roadway were improperly manufactured and can't be hooked up. And so the contractors now have to epoxy together over 500 pieces of guardrail in order to get them attached correctly and to finish the project. A representative of the State Roads Commission says that it's coming down to the wire. He will do his best. The State Roads Commission will do their best to give 2 days notice. They don't want it to be a complete surprise when the bridge opens. So they will try to give 2 days notice before the bridge opens. As it turns out, they're able to give 3 days notice. The bridge opens on March 23rd, 1976, and they're able to publish that in the Baltimore Sun just a few days earlier, 3 days earlier, on March 20th specifically. What does Baltimore think about? Oh, I'm sorry, I may have uh, I as someone in the chat noticed, I do apologize. This date is supposed to be 1977, not 1976. Apologies. I knew I was going to get at least one date wrong. Hopefully, that's the only one. What does Baltimore think about this? Well, the main consensus at the time is great views from the bridge itself, but they do have to be careful of bad weather. The bridge closes when high winds kick up, and during icy conditions, as we see on the right here, there is during icy conditions, the bridge can be particularly dangerous for drivers. But there's a question of, did the Key Bridge accomplish what it was meant to? It was meant to alleviate traffic going through the harbor tunnel and better facilitate people driving through Baltimore City. Uh, this graph shows traffic for the month of April in 1976, 77, 78, and 79, the orange being the harbor tunnel, that first structure, and the blue being the Key Bridge. The Key Bridge never reached the level of traffic consistently that the harbor did. These ratios were pretty consistent throughout its history. But and what this is showing is about 2 million vehicles traveling through the harbor tunnel in a month each year. A bit of a dip as the Key Bridge opens and alleviates traffic, and the Key Bridge only rising to about 500,000 vehicles traveling over it in the same time period. But that is enough to help alleviate traffic, and Baltimoreans are certainly appreciative of having that extra option for crossing. I did want to acknowledge very briefly the community impact. When the Coast Guard wrote its gave the permitting to approve the Key Bridge as a bridge and not a tunnel, one of the comments that they made was that there would be minimal impact on the community because in both Anne Arundel County and Baltimore County, where the bridges would connect to land, it was largely industrial areas, areas zoned for heavy industry and not residential. That is true for the Curtis Bay area in Anne Arundel County in the southern stretch, but in the northern approach to the bridge in Baltimore County, the highways that were constructed had to move through Dundalk and specifically the community of Turner Station, which had been built in the early days. Unfortunately, it's a much larger story that I definitely need to move very quickly through. But originally, Turner Station was, when Dundalk and Turner Station were segregated communities, Turner Station was the Black neighborhood adjacent to Sparrows Point and largely for workers at the Bethlehem Steel Company. And still decades later in the 1970s, it was largely a Black community. Um, the concerns about increased traffic through Turner Station were never really resolved. There were steps taken to alleviate traffic. Sorry, they were never resolved as the bridge was being built. There were steps taken in the years afterwards, with steps being taken to try to alleviate traffic through Turner Station, leading up to 1980. But even so, still to this day, if you look at the permitting that Key Bridge Rebuild is doing for the upcoming structure, their maps do still acknowledge that Anne Arundel County, the zoning around the bridge is industrial or not developed at all, whereas there is still residential zoning very close to where the Key Bridge hits land in Baltimore County. Another interesting point is the view that Baltimoreans driving over the bridge now get looking down on that heavy industry. Um, I knew going into this presentation that I probably over-prepared, and in the interest of time, I want to skip through some, unfortunately, very interesting points. Stories that I will not be able to share tonight in the interest of time is a paint company accidentally releasing noxious gas, which passed over the Key Bridge in October of 19 in October of 1978, and the bridge happened to be closed for 10 minutes. This is an era of the creation of the EPA and in environmental regulations. I can't say for certain that any regulations were specifically created because of people driving over the Key Bridge, but it is certainly the case that people looking down on that industry got a new perspective on the factories around Baltimore, which certainly played into the context of the growing environmental movement. In 1980, I did want to talk just very briefly. 6 months after a major accident, one of the largest in the history of bridges in the United States, a bridge came down in Tampa Bay in 1980, unfortunately leading to the deaths of a few dozen people. And just 6 months later, the Key Bridge was struck as well. Just in a sheer coincidence, 6 hours before the Key Bridge was struck, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge was struck as well. There are interesting comparisons between the events of 1980 and what happened last spring. Stop me if you've heard this story before. In fact, looking at the time, I will have to stop very soon. This is a very brief report on the 1980 incident, and in the broad strokes, a container ship leaving the port of Baltimore lost power in the approach to the bridge. It was originally traveling at 12 knots an hour. It managed to slow down, but was still traveling at or sorry, just 12 knots. It was still traveling at 6 knots when it struck the bridge. The main difference, of course, between the events of last spring and the ship strike in 1980 is that the ship was much, much smaller in 1980. The size of ships has grown exponentially. Well, maybe not literally exponentially, but it's grown significantly in the last 40 years. And the ship was small enough to not deal the significant damage um, that we saw last spring. Both ships in 1980 and last spring were on an approach that completely missed those concrete dolphins that I mentioned earlier, but they did collide with the structure of the bridge. In 1980, the fender did exactly what it was supposed to do. It was completely destroyed and had to be rebuilt, which was the $500,000 of repair costs that the earlier slide mentioned. But fortunately, the structure itself was largely undamaged, which is why the bridge actually only ended up closing on the day of the accident, only ended up closing for a few hours. As I mentioned at the beginning, this presentation basically only went up to 1980. There isn't a ton of exciting news about the Key Bridge between 1980 and 2024. There are, of course, maintenance ongoing changes with toll fees and switching to the Easy Pass system. But the major news, of course, is the events last spring. Um, we are approaching the end of the presentation, and in just a moment, I will be happy to switch over to any questions that folks might have about work that the BMI is doing to preserve this history and the history itself of the Key Bridge, anything I might have mentioned. Feel free to drop those questions in the chat or Q&A, and I'll answer those in just a moment. I did want to give just a very brief look at some of the news that's been announced by Keybridge Rebuild. This is the organization now that is spearheading the rebuild project and particularly releasing information and community engagement around it. In the months just after the Keybridge came down, there was official news coming from lots of different sources, the Baltimore City government, state government, Maryland Transportation Authority, and Keybridge Rebuild has since consolidated a lot of that information. Some of the major contracts have been awarded. Hewitt Infrastructure Company is the progressive design builder awarded last summer. They are similar to the role that the Griner Company paid with the original or served with the original structure. They are the main like designers and overseers of the project going forward. Uh, Bridging Maryland Partnership is an organization kind of bringing together three companies to serve as a general engineering consultant. They will be the ones mostly kind of the liaison between Maryland Transportation Authority and Hewitt Infrastructure, providing a lot of the administrative support and keeping things on track both for the design phase and later construction. Hewitt Infrastructure and WSP USA are some of the largest engineering companies, not just in the United States, but around the world. The two companies listed down towards the bottom, JM&T and Rummel, Klepper and Call, are local companies in their origins. JM&T getting started in the 1920s in a Baltimore townhouse, and Rummel, Klepper and Call getting started a little bit later, I believe in the 1980s. But both Maryland companies, wide range of work now, but much smaller comparatively to the larger companies listed here. In October, a preliminary design was released for the reconstruction efforts. The idea was always that they needed to get something on paper in order to move forward with the permitting and solicit community feedback. This was always meant to be something kind of an iterative process. So Keybridge Rebuild has been very upfront about the fact that there will be applications later to adjust this design as it goes forward. Just a few of the major differences between the structure that we may be used to and what's planning on being built between now and hopefully being opened towards the end of the 2020s. I believe the estimated opening date is 2028. Instead of being a continuous truss bridge, which I explained before, instead it will be um, apologies, a different design with I believe the phrase is a cable stayed bridge. But the exact phrase is escaping me at the moment, which is the difference in design that you see here, the number of support cables going down to carry the bridge itself. Um, there is also more dolphins planned compared to the four that were surrounding the structure previously, at least six. And I do believe that those dolphins, at least for the initial design, those dolphins are planned to be larger. What's next for news coming out of Keybridge Rebuilt? We're anticipating that there could be news soon about updates to this design. They have released some information. If you're interested in following that, you can check out their website, and they have a Facebook page where they're showing off some of their community engagement. The only work going on right now, and there is plenty of work going on, is environmental surveying and voluntary property assessments for any properties close to the work that might be impacted. The residents can welcome um, uh, folks from Keybridge Rebuild to come in and do property assessments for kind of future documentation. And there are some of the environmental work being done. Some of the surveying does include barges on the water. I've got actually some latest news. Thank you very much from one of our attendees in the chat saying that one of two barges has apparently just shown up in the water today. That is part of the boring, taking samples from the bed of the water as part of the environmental surveying. And here's I don't believe based on when this picture was taken, I don't believe this is one of the barges actually on the river at the moment. This is from presumably from an earlier project. As I mentioned, where you can get more information from keybridgerebuild.com, which is where they're sharing the majority of their resources. Keybridge Rebuild Facebook has already has some videos and pictures posted, and presumably more news will be shared there as well. That's relatively recent, getting started only within the last month or two. And there are live community events, which you can find out more about on the Keybridge Rebuild website, where you can go and actually speak to representatives of Keybridge Rebuild. I do want to give just a very quick shout out to them for some of the information that they shared and the support that they're giving to this presentation and the larger project that the Baltimore Museum of Industry has to preserve and present the story of the Key Bridge. What we have here on the left is a quick snapshot of some of the oral history interviews we're conducting. We're hoping to release some mini documentaries in the coming months with some of the documentaries sharing the stories of some of the folks most directly impacted. And this is a photo of a mural that was featured at the December program that I mentioned at the very start of this presentation. With that, a whirlwind tour through a couple decades of engineering and political history. Thank you all very much for bearing with me, particularly as I got rushed towards the end and went over time. I apologize for that. I notice at least a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to, and the Q&A as well. So um, for the folks who are still staying on, feel free to continue dropping any questions into the chat or Q&A that might occur to you. You're also welcome to follow up with us as well. You should have received some emails in the lead up to this program, and you'll receive an email with a survey going out tomorrow morning. You're more than welcome to respond to that. It will go directly to me. If you think of any questions, comments, feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will bring down the screen sharing just uh, just so you can hopefully see me a little bit better while I turn to some of these questions. Um, a question from, let's see, starting with the Q&A panel, a question from the about funding. Do we know how much the costs of the original construction were borne by Maryland versus how much was paid for by the federal government? That is an excellent question, and not something that I have at my fingertips. I do know the uh, state side of that, which is, as I mentioned, this joint project. As they were funding the and building, planning the what ended up becoming the Key Bridge, they were also building the second stretch of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. When the Bay Bridge first opened, it was only one structure, whereas now the Bay Bridge that we know today has the two spans going each direction. Um, those two projects were funded, as I mentioned, through $220 million of bond sales. The idea was that the state would be able to pay off those bonds in the subsequent years based on toll revenue collected by the various toll structures across the state of Maryland. I do believe that that was ultimately successful, even though there were there was additional funding needed. The budget had to be increased, particularly for both the Chesapeake Bay Bridge and the outer harbor crossing, the Key Bridge. Um, but it was, I believe, largely toll revenue that ultimately funded the projects. And a timeline or definitive date for completion of the Beltway is another question from the Q&A. The question doesn't specify the original completion for the Beltway or talking about the future when the reconstruction is is expected to conclude. Um, the Beltway was finished with the completion of the Key Bridge in 1977. So up until that point, folks could travel around the majority of what we now know is the full run of the Baltimore Beltway. But it wasn't until the Key Bridge opened that full access was allowed around. Um, in terms of the estimated date for completion of the recompleting the construction, or sorry, completion of rebuilding the Key Bridge, I believe, and I unfortunately should probably double check this, but I'm gonna go ahead and take a guess anyway, see if I have it in my notes. I believe that the initially shared, like the current estimate, is to have the reconstruction completed by 2028. So it would be another 3 years before the Key Bridge reopens. But there is, I think, given the history of the bridge and of pretty much the full range of construction projects in the state of Maryland and across U.S. history, Baltimoreans should probably expect a little bit of leeway with where that date may end up. Let's see. Um, as I scroll through and kind of look for some other questions in the chat. There was a question a few minutes ago about Bethlehem Steel and whether or not they provided the steel. That is an excellent question, and unfortunately not one that I have an answer to. I believe that the steel was provided by the steel for the structure itself was provided by the contractor that I mentioned earlier, who was based out of Pittsburgh. The Des Moines Steel. Yep, Des Moines Steel of Pittsburgh. Um, I that is something that I was hoping to find in kind of the museum's records or in additional research, and that isn't something I was able to find. My assumption is that it comes down to costs that the Bethlehem Steel Company wasn't able to provide steel within the funding required. That they it would have been more expensive. Their proposal was more expensive than their competitors. Although, given news from the era, I guess it is possible as well that the Des Moines Steel Company was simply better politically connected than Bethlehem Steel was. But I think that's definitely something that is going to require additional research. I apologize for not having the definitive answer. Um, let's see. Uh, Going back to the Q&A, there was a question, as ships got bigger, was there ever any discussion of adding more dolphins? There was certainly discussion in 1980, in the 6 months between the Sunshine Bridge collapsing in Tampa Bay towards the beginning of the year and the ship strike for the Key Bridge. There was reporting done in the Baltimore Sun about whether or not there was kind of anticipation, could this happen in Maryland? And the kind of widely acknowledged answer was our only strategy for the bridges surviving a major ship strike is for the bridges to just not get hit. The way the bridges are constructed, and particularly with the size of ships getting into the 80s, 90s, and certainly today, the amount of force that a ship would deliver traveling at any significant speed simply because of the mass behind it. There is essentially, it is almost an impossible problem of trying to design a bridge that would survive an incident like what occurred last spring. Um, Kind of getting into some historical whataboutism, there does seem to be, while there are additional measures being taken to try to make sure that a repeat of that incident doesn't happen once the Key Bridge is rebuilt, particularly with the tentative plans that have been proposed so far. The main support structures will be further apart to allow more space for ships to pass in between, and additional dolphins, as I mentioned. But even so, it is very difficult to say what, if anything, could have been done differently in the design of the original structure that would have allowed it to survive the ship strike last spring. There's a question about will the reconstructed bridge include a bike lane? And the commenter points to a bridge on the Washington Beltway that does include a bike lane. The proposal so far, I don't believe explicitly includes a bike lane. It does I do know that the proposal so far will have a wider bridge, not to accommodate more traffic. The old bridge was 4 lanes, two going each direction, and the proposal has 4 lanes again. But the bridge will be wider in order to allow more of a shoulder and to meet modern standards of the width of what would be expected and required for modern construction road construction projects. I haven't heard any of that kind of extra space be referred to as kind of pedestrian or bike access. Although again, the designs are expected to change, so that information could receive an update between now and when it is actually built.
Hey, Mike, just to kind of add in, I did see that one of our guests commented that there are no plans for bike lanes. So just thought
Yes.
I'd circle back there.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Deborah. Um, And in it, I think I do want to wrap up in just a moment, but I want to feature one question in particular. Thank you very much to our own Jack Burkhart for asking this. He mentioned renaming the bridge. There has been a discussion that I have seen in the last few months about potentially renaming the bridge. Um, and I will share I will echo the thoughts of the representative from Keybridge Rebuild that I had the good fortune of interviewing in preparing for this. Her attitude was that it essentially we can look at history. And the bridge was under construction was planned for a number of years and even under construction for a while before a name was settled. And I think we can expect the same. Any discussion about the name of the bridge probably will not happen overnight or will not happen in the next few weeks or months. And it's going to be up to Baltimore and Maryland's community to weigh in. That is the kind of work that Keybridge Rebuild is doing very intently now, making sure that they are reaching out to the community, being there at as many in-person events as possible. We had the good fortune of having them join us for our in-person event in December. And I think we're just going to have to see how it plays out, whether or not there's enough of a movement to rename the Key Bridge. Although I do believe that any energy put forward to change the name of the bridge has been at least matched, at least from my perspective, by community interest in keeping the name the same and keeping consistency and recognizing the history of the structure for Baltimore. But again, only time will tell. Thank you all very much for sticking around for a presentation that went a bit over time for what I anticipated. I think there are some questions in the chat that we didn't quite get to. One caught my attention. I can't resist. Um, Somebody asked, is there an exhibit at the Museum of Industry? We are currently hoping to launch an exhibit in the future, but it will take time. This presentation is part of a much larger initiative to preserve and present the history of the Key Bridge. We are actively fundraising to be able to deliver more programs like these and hopefully to be able to do an exhibit. While nothing is official, we are in talks with Key Bridge Rebuild and the Maryland Transportation Authority to receive a piece of the bridge, which would hopefully serve as a centerpiece around which we could build an exhibit. But all of that is again, updates still to come. So stay tuned, both from Key Bridge Rebuild and from the Baltimore Museum of Industry. We look forward to sharing more of this ongoing story and a little bit more of the history of Baltimore going forward. With that, I'll just say thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation, and I hope we'll see you at some upcoming programs in the future. Have a good night.